This is an analysis of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech, A Time to Break Silence, by Katie Ackett, Tyler Johnson, Maya Smith, and Emily Selecki. Martin Luther King Jr. gave the speech, A Time to Break Silence, on April 4, 1967, regarding American involvement in the Vietnam War. King was a strong civil rights supporter, a member of the NAACP, and he was the pastor of Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. At the time he gave his speech, Americans were upset at the fact many U.S. troops were being killed and injured, and because other countries were accusing the U.S. government of supporting dictatorship.
Well-known civil rights activist Martin Luther King Jr., in his speech, A Time to Break Silence, addresses the fact that America appears to be supporting violence and militarism by participating in the Vietnam War. King's purpose is to advocate his anti-war views to citizens and encourage the removal of troops from Vietnam. He adopts a passionate tone to convey to the audience that it is unnecessary to be sending men to fight in a war aimed to take the lives of innocent civilians.
Throughout his speech, King uses rhetorical questions to engage his audience and challenge their beliefs on American involvement in the war. He points out the most horrific parts of the war and speaks for the innocent people facing these terrible injustices. To quote, King says, "What do they think as we test our latest weapons on them, just as the Germans tested out new medicine and new tortures in the concentration camps of Europe? What are the roots of the independent Vietnam we claim to be building? Is it among these voiceless ones?" Throughout his questioning, Dr. King manages to persuade many audiences from many walks of life by giving them a framework to paint their own picture in his lighting.
Repetition is something used frequently in King's speeches, specifically his use of anaphora. Passionately, he declares, "Somehow this madness must cease. We must stop now. I speak as a child of God and a brother to the suffering poor of Vietnam. I speak for those whose land is being laid waste, whose homes are being destroyed, whose culture is being subverted. I speak for the poor of America who are paying double price of smashed hopes at home and death of corruption in Vietnam." Dr. King's repetition of the phrase, "I speak as," is used to grab the listener's attention and relate it to them personally. He develops pathos by giving a voice to the voiceless and persuades his listeners to consider his side, whether or not they're in support of the war.
One particularly powerful quote from the speech is when Dr. King recites to his audience, "The business of burning human beings with napalm, of filling our nation's homes with orphans and widows, of injecting poisonous drugs of hate into veins of people normally humane, of sending men home from dark and bloody battlefields, physically handicapped and psychologically damaged, cannot be reconciled with wisdom, justice, and love." King's use of powerful language impacts his audience in a strong way. He uses imagery and various metaphors to develop a sense of pathos in the audience by pointing out how truly horrific it was to be sending our troops to Vietnam. Furthermore, the syntax, or more specifically King's use of a periodic sentence within the passage, is enough to grab the audience's attention. By listing off the various atrocities being committed by sending our people to war, he builds up suspense to the end of the sentence where he ends it with a powerful aphorism, reminding his audience that peace won't be achieved by just sitting back and waiting for it to happen. Towards the end of the speech, King begins to give his listeners a call to action as he empowers them, as well as lays out the consequences for those who just chose to sit back and let the war happen. He says, "We must move past indecision to action. We must find new ways to speak for peace in Vietnam and justice throughout the developing world, a world that borders on our doors. If we do not act, we surely shall be dragged down the long, dark, and shameful corridors of time reserved for those who possess power without compassion, might without morality, and strength without right." The figurative language used in this quote lays out the point King is trying to get across in a way that captivates the audience. The use of parallelism, specifically isocolon, in the last sentence ends the quote much more powerfully and leaves the audience impacted by Dr. King's words, pushing them to want to truly make a change in regard to American involvement in the Vietnam War.
There is a reason that Dr. King was able to gather such an audience for his movement, and that is because he knows the right devices to use and the right places to use them. His use of rhetorical strategies throughout his speech makes his argument more impactful and appeals to the reader's sense of empathy. King's speech is noteworthy in convincing his audience to remove troops from Vietnam.
Created using Powtoon.